It wasn't supposed to end like this. When Sarah first mentioned the party, I didn't think much of it. We had been married long enough for me to know her routine. A night out with Tara and her crew, drinks, maybe dancing. Nothing too wild. At least, that's what I used to think. But something about this party felt different. Maybe it was the way she casually dropped it into conversation, or the fact that Tara had a reputation for throwing the kind of parties where anything goes. I tried not to overthink it, but my gut wouldn't let it go. I knew her well enough to pick up on the subtle shifts. The way she seemed distracted lately, the late nights without much explanation. We'd had fights about it before, but this time, it wasn't just frustration or jealousy on my part. This time, it felt like something was slipping. Something important. The night before the party, I told her how I felt. "I don't think you should go," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's not that I don't trust you, Sarah, but lately, I don't know, it feels like we're not on the same page anymore." I didn't expect her to react the way she did. "You're being paranoid again," she snapped, her eyes narrowing. "It's just a party Tara's throwing, not some strangers. Why do you always do this?" "Always." That word hit me harder than I expected. She made it sound like I was constantly watching her, suffocating her with doubt. But that wasn't the case. I had given her space, let her live her life, trusting that our bond was strong enough to withstand whatever temptations came her way. But lately, she'd been distant, emotionally and physically. We were still under the same roof, but it was like I could feel her slipping away. "I'm not trying to control you," I said, fighting to stay calm. "I'm just telling you how I feel. Something about this party feels off. I don't like it. Can we at least talk about it?" She rolled her eyes, dismissing me as if my concerns were nothing more than petty insecurities. "Talk about what? You're acting like I'm going to run off with some guy the moment I walk through the door. It's just a night out, for God's sake." That wasn't it. It wasn't just a night out. It was everything that had been building up over the last few months. The distance, the late nights with vague excuses, the way she no longer seemed present when we were together. I felt like I was losing her, piece by piece, and this party felt like a tipping point. But instead of pushing it further, I let her go. I don't know why. Maybe I was tired of fighting, tired of feeling like I was always the one trying to pull us back together, while she seemed more and more eager to drift apart. So, when she left that night, I didn't stop her. But I couldn't sit still. As the hours dragged on, I found myself pacing the house, my mind racing with all the things I didn't want to think about. The silence was deafening. By midnight I hadn't heard a word from her, no call, no text. Just the cold, empty house. I made a decision, one that would change everything. I grabbed my phone, opened the tracking app we had installed months ago when she kept losing her phone, and I followed her. It felt wrong, invasive even, but at that moment I didn't care. I needed to know where she was, what she was doing, and I had to know the truth, no matter how ugly it was. The app loaded, and her location popped up. I expected it to show her at Tara's house, maybe a bar nearby. Instead, it showed something that made my stomach drop, a motel on the edge of town. I stared at the screen, trying to process it. A motel? What the hell was she doing there? My heart raced, anger and dread building inside me. This wasn't just a party. Something else was happening. Something I hadn't allowed myself to believe. Without thinking, I grabbed my keys and headed for the door. The drive to the motel felt like it took hours, though it was probably only 20 minutes. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles turned white. I could feel the blood rushing in my ears, my heart pounding harder with every mile. I kept checking my phone, watching the blinking dot that marked Sarah's location, still at the motel. Still there. Not moving. I wanted to turn back, pretend I hadn't seen it. Part of me hoped it was a mistake, that she was there for some completely innocent reason and I was just overreacting. But deep down, I knew the distance between us over the past months wasn't my imagination. It wasn't just stress or work. It was something more. Something darker. When I pulled into the parking lot, I parked a little ways from the building, not wanting to draw attention. There were only a few cars, none I recognized. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, staring at the sign for Westmore Motel. The neon letters buzzed faintly in the night. The place was run down, the kind of spot people went when they didn't want to be seen. Cheap. Discreet. The perfect place for affairs or secrets. I opened the app again, my thumb hovering over the screen, as if waiting for it to tell me something different. But the little dot hadn't moved. She was still there, in one of those rooms. The room number wasn't listed, but I could figure it out. There were only a few possibilities. I got out of the car and walked across the parking lot, trying to steady my breathing, trying not to imagine the worst. The cool night air did nothing to calm me down. My mind raced through every worst-case scenario, images flashing through my head, Sarah in a room with someone else, laughing, smiling, doing the things she hadn't done with me in months. I walked past a few rooms, each door marked with a faded number, 201, 202, 203. As I neared the end of the row, I slowed down, my heart pounding in my chest. I stopped at the last few rooms, my eyes scanning the parking lot. And then I saw it, her car, parked at the far end, tucked away as if she didn't want anyone to see. That was all the confirmation I needed. I stood there for a moment, staring at her car, the realization crashing down on me. There was no more pretending, no more excuses. She was here, in a motel, and there was no good reason for it. The trust we had was shattered, replaced by something I didn't want to acknowledge. I walked up to the door of the room closest to her car, my fists clenched at my sides. Room 214. The blinds were closed, the faint glow of a lamp spilling out from the edges. I hesitated, my breath shallow. Did I really want to know? Did I really want to see what was behind that door? Yes, I had to. I raised my hand to knock but stopped just inches from the door. Instead, I pressed my ear against it, listening. At first, there was nothing but silence. Then faint voices, hers laughing softly. A man's voice followed, muffled, but enough to send a surge of rage through me. I didn't need to hear more. Without thinking, I banged on the door hard. The voices inside stopped abruptly. I could hear movement, shuffling, whispers, panic. My mind was racing, my body shaking with adrenaline. I knocked again, louder this time. Sarah! Open the door! I shouted, my voice cracking with anger. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then the door opened a crack, just enough for me to see her face. She looked pale, shocked, as if she couldn't believe I was standing there. Her hair was messy, her makeup smudged, like she'd been caught in the middle of something she couldn't talk her way out of. Rumpled sheets on the bed, and a man sitting on the edge. "What the hell are you doing here?" she hissed, her voice low, her eyes darting around like she was checking if anyone else was watching. I didn't care about the scene. "What am I doing here? What are you doing here?" I shot back, pushing the door open wider. I could see the room now. Looking equally stunned, he wasn't anyone I recognized, just some random guy. Exactly as I'd feared, Sarah stepped out, closing the door behind her, trying to block my view. "This isn't what it looks like," she said, her voice wavering, but her eyes gave her away. She was scrambling, desperate to regain control of the situation. I laughed, the sound bitter and cold. "Isn't it? Because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly like what it is." I couldn't believe this was happening. Couldn't believe how easily she had betrayed me, after everything. After all the chances I had given her, she was here, doing this. She reached out, trying to grab my arm. "Let me explain," she pleaded, her voice shaky, but I pulled away, disgusted. "Explain? Explain what, Sarah? You're here in a motel with him," I said, my voice hard, each word laced with the weight of her betrayal. She opened her mouth, but no words came. For the first time, she couldn't lie her way out of it, and that's when I knew it was over. There was nothing left to salvage. Sarah's hand dropped to her side, the look on her face shifting from shock to something colder, defensive, like she was already calculating her next move. The man inside hadn't bothered to come out. He was still sitting there, probably hoping I'd just leave, too cowardly to face the damage he'd helped cause. "This isn't how you think it is," Sarah said, her voice steadier now, like she was trying to take back control of the situation. But it was too late. I had already seen enough. "Just let me explain, okay? Can we go somewhere and talk?" I shook my head, disbelief and anger churning inside me. "Talk? What is there to talk about, Sarah? You're standing in front of a motel room with another man. I've been worried sick, thinking something was wrong with us, and here you are proving me right." She glanced back at the door, her eyes flicking toward the guy inside, then back to me. She was panicking. I could see it, trying to think of how to spin this, how to make it seem like less than what it was. "It's not what you think. It's just things haven't been right between us for a while, and I didn't know how to deal with it. I came here to clear my head." "To clear your head? Is that what you call this?" I interrupted, my voice rising. "I don't need to hear your excuses, Sarah. You're caught. Don't insult me by pretending this is anything but what it is." She took a step toward me, her expression softening, like she thought she could still fix this, manipulate the situation. "I'm sorry, okay? I messed up. I know I messed up, but let's go somewhere and talk about this. We can figure it out." "Figure it out?" The words echoed in my head, hollow and meaningless. How was there anything left to figure out when the person I thought I knew had been lying to my face for months? I backed up, putting more distance between us. "No, Sarah. You don't get it. I'm done. There's nothing left to figure out. You made your choice the moment you stepped into that room. You didn't care about us then, and you don't care now." She opened her mouth to say something, but I didn't give her the chance. "Was it worth it?" I asked, my voice lower now, not out of anger but exhaustion. I felt tired, drained from months of carrying the weight of our crumbling relationship alone. "Was it worth blowing up everything we had? Because I'm done fighting for someone who already walked away." For a moment, she didn't say anything. Her eyes dropped to the ground, her facade cracking just enough for me to see the guilt underneath. But the guilt wasn't for me, it was for herself. She was sorry she got caught, sorry this wasn't playing out the way she'd hoped. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she whispered, her voice breaking just a little. "I didn't think it would get this far." I stared at her, incredulous. "Get this far? Sarah, you've been lying to me for months. You've been disappearing, making excuses, and I've been sitting at home like an idiot, thinking it was my fault. And now you're telling me you didn't mean for it to get this far? That's all you have to say?" She looked up at me, her eyes pleading. "Please, I don't want this to be the end. We can fix this. I'll end it with him. I swear. I'll make it right." I laughed, but it wasn't out of humor. It was the laugh of someone who had finally reached the breaking point, who realized how far beyond saving things had gone. "End it with him? It was already over, Sarah, the moment you decided to lie. The moment you chose someone else over us. It was done. You don't get to make it right now." The tears started then, real or fake, I couldn't tell anymore. She stood there, wiping at her eyes, trying to look remorseful, but it didn't matter. The damage was done, and no amount of tears would change that. I felt nothing but cold, hollow resignation. "You need to leave," I said quietly, the anger replaced by exhaustion. "Go back inside, do whatever you want, but don't come home. We're done." She shook her head, panic flooding her face again. "Please don't say that. Don't just throw us away like this." "Throw us away?" I repeated, feeling my anger surge one last time. "You already did that. I'm just finishing what you started." I turned and walked away, each step feeling heavier but more certain than the last. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see the regret on her face, didn't want to hear any more of her lies or apologies. As I got into my car, the weight of it all hit me. It was over, years of marriage, of love, of trust, gone in a single night. And yet, as I drove away from that motel, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel: relief. It was like I had been carrying this unbearable weight for months, trying to fix something that was already broken. Now, at least the truth was out, and the fight was finally over. As I drove away from the motel, the weight of the night settled in. I gripped the steering wheel hard, knuckles white, as the city lights blurred past. The adrenaline was starting to wear off, leaving behind a numbness that seeped into my bones. I didn't feel angry anymore. I didn't feel betrayed either. I just felt empty. It wasn't supposed to end like this. Not with some half-hearted apology outside a sleazy motel, not with Sarah pleading for something we both knew was already gone. I'd spent years believing that we could work through anything, that whatever rough patches we hit were temporary. But standing in that parking lot, listening to her lies fall apart one by one, I realized something. The Sarah I married wasn't there anymore. Maybe she hadn't been for a long time. I pulled into the driveway. The familiar sight of our house brought no comfort. It looked the same, but it felt different. This wasn't home anymore. It was just a house, a place where two people had drifted apart, pretending they could hold on to something that had died long before tonight. I sat in the car for a few minutes, staring at the front door, knowing that once I stepped inside, everything would change. I didn't have the energy to face it yet, not the memories, not the silence. So I just sat there, running through the past few months in my head, replaying every moment where I should have seen the signs, the late nights out with no explanation, the way she'd come home and act like nothing was wrong, even though I could feel the distance growing between us. The moments when I tried to talk to her, tried to connect, and she'd shut down, dismissing my concerns like I was imagining things. How long had she been cheating? How long had she'd been hiding this from me? I could feel the bitterness rising in my chest, but I pushed it down. There was no point in being angry now. The truth was, I had already lost her months ago. I had just been too stubborn to see it. Finally, I forced myself to get out of the car and walk inside. The house was dark, quiet, just like it had been when she left earlier that night. I tossed my keys on the counter and stood there in the kitchen, the weight of everything crashing down on me. I glanced at the clock. It was 2 a.m. She'd be back soon, or at least I thought she would. The fight outside the motel had been raw, brutal, but I knew Sarah well enough to know that she wouldn't just disappear. She would try to come home, try to explain, try to convince me that it was all a mistake, that we could fix it. But I was done. I walked to the fridge, grabbed a beer, and sank into the couch, staring at the wall as I took a long drink. The taste was bitter, but it didn't matter. It was like I needed something, anything, to cut through the emptiness that was settling in. I thought back to the night we first moved into this house. We'd been married for 2 years, still in that honeymoon phase where everything felt perfect. I remember how excited Sarah had been, how we'd spent hours unpacking, laughing, talking about the future. We had plans, big plans, kids, vacations, a life we were going to build together. That seemed like a lifetime ago. Now, all I could think about was the look on her face when she'd opened that motel door, the panic, the guilt, but also the lies. Even when she was caught red-handed, she still tried to twist it, still tried to make it seem like there was something left to salvage, as if we could just sweep it all under the rug and go back to pretending everything was fine. But there was no going back, not anymore. The front door opened, and I heard her footsteps as she walked inside. She paused in the hallway, probably unsure if I'd still be here. I didn't move. I didn't say anything. I just waited, sipping my beer, staring at the wall, knowing what was coming next. She stepped into the living room, her eyes red from crying, her face pale. She looked different now, like the weight of what she'd done was finally hitting her. But it didn't matter. The damage was done. She sat down on the chair across from me, not daring to get too close. For a moment, we just sat there in silence, the distance between us feeling like miles. "Can we talk?" she finally whispered, her voice shaky. I didn't respond at first. I didn't even look at her. I just took another sip of my beer, letting the silence stretch on until it felt unbearable. "What is there to talk about?" I said quietly, my voice cold and detached. "You've said enough." She looked down, wiping at her eyes. I know I messed up. I know I hurt you, but I swear it wasn't what it looked like. I couldn't help but laugh, the sound bitter and raw. It wasn't what it looked like, Sarah. I caught you in a motel room with another man. How much worse could it be? It was a mistake, she pleaded, her voice cracking. I wasn't thinking straight. I was scared. I didn't know how to fix things between us, and I made a horrible choice. But it's not what you think. I finally turned to look at her, my eyes hard. You cheated, Sarah. You lied. And you're still lying even now. Just admit it. Stop pretending this is something it's not. She flinched at my words, her eyes welling with fresh tears. I'm not lying. I know it looks bad, but it was a one-time thing. It didn't mean anything. I was lost, and I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't know how to deal with everything. I stared at her, the anger boiling inside me again, but it wasn't the explosive kind of anger. It was the cold, settled kind, the kind that made you realize you were done. It's over, Sarah, I said quietly, setting down my beer. There's no fixing this. You made your choice. Now live with it. She shook her head, her voice rising in desperation. Please don't say that. I love you. I don't want to lose you. I stood up, walking toward the hallway. You already did. As I left the room, I could hear her sobs, but I didn't stop. The truth was out, and now it was time to let go. I walked down the hallway to the bedroom, closing the door softly behind me. Sarah's sobs echoed faintly from the living room, but I blocked them out. I sat on the edge of the bed, the weight of everything pressing down on me. It was a strange feeling, not the explosive anger or heartbreak I had expected, but a hollow kind of finality. I knew this was it. The room felt colder than usual, like it wasn't mine anymore. My eyes scanned the familiar space, the pictures on the walls, the small details of a life we had built together. Photos from vacations, wedding day smiles, most of the moments that, at one time, felt perfect. But none of it seemed real now. It was like looking at someone else's life, someone else's memories. I stared at a picture of us on our honeymoon, a beach somewhere far away, where we'd laughed like nothing in the world could touch us. How did it all fall apart so fast? Or maybe it hadn't been fast. Maybe it had been crumbling for a long time, and I just hadn't noticed until it was too late. Maybe Sarah's betrayal was just the final nail in a coffin we'd been building together, brick by brick. A soft knock on the door broke through my thoughts. I didn't answer, but Sarah pushed the door open anyway, her face tear-streaked and pale, like she was desperate to say one more thing to change my mind. Can we just talk, please? She whispered, standing in the doorway, hesitant, as if even she knew there was nothing left to say. I looked at her for a moment, the woman I had once loved, the woman I had built a life with. Now, she looked like a stranger, someone who had made choices I couldn't understand, someone who had taken everything we had and thrown it away for a moment of selfishness. What is there to talk about, Sarah? I said, my voice flat. You think more words are going to change anything? That we can somehow go back to the way things were? We're past that. Way past it. She stepped into the room, her arms wrapped around herself as if she were trying to hold herself together. I know I ruined things, she said, her voice trembling. But I don't want to lose you. I'll do anything to fix this. I'll end it with him. I'll end it. I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. There's nothing left to end, Sarah. I don't care about him. I don't care about your excuses. The moment you chose to walk into that motel room, you ended us. Her face crumpled at my words, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. Please, she whispered, her voice breaking. I love you. I know I made a terrible mistake, but I still love you. We can fix this. I know we can. I shook my head slowly, the sadness in my chest mixing with something colder. You love me? I repeated, my voice quiet. You sure about that? Because it doesn't feel like love. It feels like guilt, and that's not enough to fix what you broke. She collapsed onto the bed, burying her face in her hands, her sobs growing louder. But I couldn't comfort her. I couldn't reach for her like I used to. Because the truth was, I didn't trust her anymore. Not after this, not after what she'd done. My voice steady. I can't stay here and pretend we can fix this. We're done. She looked up at me, panic flashing in her eyes. What do you mean you're leaving? Where will you go? I didn't have an answer. I hadn't thought that far ahead. All I knew was that I couldn't stay in this house, in this life we built on a foundation of lies. I needed to be anywhere but here. I don't know yet, I admitted, but I'll figure it out. I just know I can't stay. She stood up, reaching for me, her voice desperate. Please don't go. Don't just walk out like this. We can go to therapy. We can work through this. I'll do whatever it takes. I stepped back out of her reach, shaking my head. No. This isn't something we can fix with therapy, Sarah. You crossed the line, and there's no coming back from it. You made your choice, and now I'm making mine. The silence stretched between us, heavy and unbearable. For a moment, I almost regretted it, almost wished I could go back to the days when things were simple, when we were happy. But those days were gone, and pretending otherwise would only drag us both down further. I grabbed a duffel bag from the closet, throwing in a few essentials, clothes, my laptop, whatever I thought I might need for a few days away. Sarah watched, her face crumpling with every item I packed. It was like each piece of clothing was a symbol of what I was taking with me, the final pieces of the life we had shared. When I zipped up the bag and slung it over my shoulder, she stepped in front of me, blocking the door. You can't just leave, she said, her voice trembling. I love you. Please don't throw us away like this. I met her eyes, feeling the weight of her words but knowing deep down that they were too little, too late. I'm not throwing anything away, Sarah. You did that. I'm just walking away from the wreckage. I stepped around her and walked out of the bedroom. The house felt colder, emptier than it ever had, but I didn't look back. I didn't let myself hesitate. The front door clicked shut behind me, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something like freedom. The moment the door clicked shut behind me, the weight of everything finally started to lift. It wasn't a rush of relief like I'd hoped, but more of a quiet emptiness, the kind of silence you only get after a storm, where the wreckage is all around you, but at least the storm itself is gone. I got in my car and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, staring out at the quiet street. I had no plan, no destination in mind. All I knew was that I couldn't stay in that house another second. The life I had built with Sarah was over, and now I had to figure out how to rebuild something new, something that didn't involve her. I drove aimlessly for a while, the streets empty at this late hour. My mind was racing but strangely numb at the same time. I had replayed every word we'd exchanged, every plea she'd made, but none of it changed the cold reality of what had happened. She had broken something between us that couldn't be fixed, no matter how many apologies or tears she offered. After about 20 minutes, I found myself pulling into the parking lot of a cheap motel. I parked in the back, irony not lost on me considering where this night had started. But I wasn't in the mood for reflection. I just needed a place to crash, a place where I could think without the weight of that house hanging over me. The motel was as run down as I'd expected, fluorescent lights flickering in the hallway, thin walls, and the smell of stale smoke clinging to everything. But I didn't care. I paid for the room in cash, checked in, and walked down the dimly lit corridor, the sound of my footsteps echoing off the walls. When I opened the door to my room, it was just as depressing as I'd imagined. Cheap furniture, a bed that looked like it hadn't been comfortable in years, and a flickering TV that I had no intention of turning on. But it didn't matter. This wasn't home. It wasn't supposed to be. It was just somewhere I could exist for the night without thinking about what came next. I tossed my duffel bag on the bed and sat down beside it, running my hands through my hair, trying to calm the storm in my head. It was strange. This was the first time in years that I was truly alone. No Sarah, no pretending that we were okay. Just me, sitting in a motel room, trying to process how my life had unraveled in a single night. I pulled out my phone and stared at it, unsure of who to call, if anyone. Mark, my best friend, was probably asleep, and I wasn't sure I was ready to explain everything just yet. I scrolled through my contacts, hovering over his name for a moment before putting the phone back down. The truth was, I wasn't ready to talk about it. Not yet. Instead, I leaned back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, the silence pressing in around me. My mind wandered back to the argument in the bedroom, the way Sarah had pleaded with me to stay, to forgive her, to fix things. But what she didn't understand was that some things couldn't be fixed. You can't just patch over a betrayal like this and hope it'll heal. Trust isn't something you can piece back together once it's been shattered. I had given her everything, years of my life, my loyalty, my trust, and she'd thrown it away for someone else, for whatever thrill or escape she thought she needed. It wasn't just the act of cheating. It was the lies, the months of distance, the way she had let our marriage rot from the inside while pretending everything was fine. I turned onto my side, the motel bed creaking under me, and tried to close my eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. My mind kept replaying the moment I'd seen her at the motel, the way she had looked at me, the panic in her eyes when she realized she was caught. It was like a broken record in my head, playing over and over, refusing to let me forget. I grabbed my phone again, scrolling through old photos, pictures of me and Sarah from better days. There was one of us on a hike, smiling at the camera, arms around each other, looking like the perfect couple. It was hard to believe that the people in those photos were the same ones who had stood in that bedroom hours ago, tearing each other apart. The morning light filtered through the thin curtains of the motel room, casting a pale glow over everything. I woke up groggy, the stiffness in my neck reminding me that this was no place for comfort. It took a second for the fog in my mind to clear, for me to remember where I was and why. The events of last night came rushing back, and I felt that hollow ache in my chest again, but it was different now, more distant. I sat up, rubbed my eyes, and glanced at the phone next to me. I half expected to see a flood of missed calls and texts from Sarah, but there was nothing. Part of me was relieved. Another part of me wondered if she'd given up trying to reach me, or if she was simply waiting for me to come crawling back. But I wasn't going back. I knew I needed to talk to someone. I couldn't keep everything bottled up. Mark, he'd been through his own rough patches before, and he was one of the few people I trusted enough to let in on all of this. I grabbed my phone and scrolled to his name, hesitating for a second before pressing call. He picked up after a couple of rings, his voice groggy but concerned. "Hey man, everything all right?" I swallowed, trying to find the right words. "No," I said finally, my voice cracking a little. "I left her, Mark. I'm at a motel right now." There was a pause on the other end, the kind of pause where you can tell someone is piecing together the right response. "What happened?" he asked, his voice softer now, like he knew this wasn't just some minor fight. "She's been cheating on me," I said, the words coming out bitter and raw. "I caught her last night at a motel with some guy. Suspicions. But not like this. It's been going on for months. I confronted her, and she kept trying to lie her way out of it. But it's over. I'm done." Mark was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Where are you now?" "Some crappy motel on the edge of town. Just needed to get out of the house. I couldn't stay there. You want me to come by? We can grab breakfast or something. Talk it through." The thought of having someone there, someone who wasn't part of this tangled mess of emotions, felt like a lifeline. "Yeah," I said, feeling a small sense of relief. "That would help." We agreed to meet at a diner not far from where I was staying, and as I got ready, I realized just how much I needed this conversation. I couldn't carry this burden on my own anymore. The drive to the diner was short, but it felt like miles, like I was leaving behind the ruins of the life I had built and stepping into something new. It wasn't liberation yet, but it was a start. Mark was already there when I arrived, sitting at a booth in the corner with 2 cups of coffee waiting on the table. He waved when he saw me, his expression one of sympathy and concern. As I sat down, he pushed a cup toward me, knowing I'd need it. "So," he said, leaning forward, his hands wrapped around his coffee mug. "Tell me everything." And I did. I told him about the weeks of distance, the growing suspicion, the lies Sarah had spun. I told him about tracking her to the motel, about the confrontation, about the way she tried to twist it even when she was caught. I laid it all out, piece by piece, like unloading a weight I'd been carrying for too long. Mark listened quietly, nodding occasionally, his expression grim. When I finished, he leaned back, letting out a slow breath. "Man, I'm sorry. There's no excuse for what she did. But I'm glad you left. You can't come back from something like that." I nodded, taking a sip of the coffee. "Yeah, I thought maybe we could fix things, but after last night, there's nothing left to fix." "So, what's your plan now?" he asked, genuinely curious. I hadn't really thought about it. I hadn't had time to. "I don't know yet," I admitted. "I guess I'll have to go back to the house at some point, figure out the next steps. Divorce, probably. Move out." The words felt foreign, like they didn't belong to me yet. Mark gave me a sympathetic look. "If you need a place to crash, my couch is always open. You don't need to be alone in that house right now." The offer was tempting, and I knew he meant it. But something in me wanted to face it head on. I needed to go back, to see the life I had left behind, if only to make sense of it all. "Thanks," I said, managing a small smile. "I might take you up on that, but I think I need to go back." "Just not yet." We spent the next hour talking, not just about Sarah, but about everything. Life, work, the small things that felt normal in a world that suddenly didn't. It was comforting in a way, knowing that even when your life falls apart, some things stay the same. Mark had a way of making things seem simpler, reminding me that this wasn't the end, it was just a really painful chapter. As we finished breakfast and stepped out into the cool morning air, I realized something. I wasn't as alone as I thought. I had friends. I had a life outside of the mess with Sarah, and for the first time since last night, I felt a flicker of hope. Not the naive hope that things would go back to the way they were, but the hope that I could rebuild. That maybe, just maybe, I could find myself again in the wreckage. "You'll get through this," Mark said, clapping me on the shoulder as we said goodbye. "You're stronger than you think." I nodded, watching him drive away, the morning sun climbing higher into the sky. And as I got back in my car, I realized that he was right. I didn't feel strong now. I didn't feel like I had any control over my life, but I had made the first step, and sometimes that's all you can do. I sat in my car outside the diner for a moment, watching the sunlight brighten the world around me. It felt like the first time I'd really seen daylight in months, even though it had only been hours since I'd walked out of that house. It was a strange sensation, being on the edge of something new with no clear idea of what the next step would be. But at least I was moving. That was enough for now. I knew I couldn't stay in limbo forever. There was still the house to deal with, still Sarah. But instead of feeling the crushing weight of all the decisions ahead, I felt a sliver of calm. I didn't have all the answers, but for the first time, I wasn't looking backward. I wasn't thinking about what I could have done differently or how I'd let things get to this point. What was done was done. I decided to head back to the house, not because I wanted to see her, but because I needed to start taking back control of my life. I needed to face the mess, to confront whatever was left. I wasn't the same person who had left the night before. That guy had walked out with a heart full of rage and betrayal, still hoping there was a chance for things to change. But now I was just ready to move on. The drive back felt faster than usual, like my mind had shifted into some higher gear, focused on what had to be done. The house came into view, our house, though it no longer felt like ours. It felt like a place where two people had lived, but only one had cared about staying. As I pulled into the driveway, I saw Sarah's car still parked out front. A part of me had hoped she would have left by now, but I knew better. She wasn't the type to disappear. She'd stay, cling to the possibility of us fixing things. But she didn't understand. There was nothing to fix. I stepped out of the car, feeling the weight of what was about to happen settle in. I walked up to the front door, taking a deep breath before stepping inside. The air in the house was heavy, thick with the tension from the night before. Sarah was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at her phone, but she looked up the moment I walked in. Her eyes were swollen, her face pale. "You came back," she said quietly, her voice hopeful but fragile. I didn't respond right away. I just stood there, looking at her, trying to reconcile the woman in front of me with the woman I had loved for years. But I couldn't. Too much had happened. "I didn't come back for us," I said finally, my voice steady but cold. "I came back to get things in order." She looked down, her hands trembling slightly. "I know you're angry. I know I messed up. But we can still—" "No," I interrupted, cutting her off before she could spin any more fantasies. "We can't. We're done, Sarah. Last night wasn't just a mistake. It was the truth coming out. You've been lying to me for months, and whatever we had, it's gone. I can't forgive that." She blinked, the reality of my words sinking in. Her mouth opened like she was about to say something, but she closed it again, as if she realized there was nothing left to argue. I could see the pain in her eyes, but I didn't feel sorry for her. She had made her choices. "So what now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I sat down across from her, feeling oddly calm. "We end this. I'll get a lawyer. We'll split the house, the finances, everything. I'll move out as soon as I can find a place. We don't need to drag this out." She looked down again, nodding slowly. "I guess I knew this was coming," she said quietly. "But I didn't think it would happen like this. Who would keep the house? Who would take what?" We divided the money, discussed what steps we need to take to get the divorce finalized. Sarah tried to be civil, but I could see the cracks in her composure. Every once in a while, she'd glance up at me, her eyes filled with guilt, like she wanted to say something that would fix everything, but she never did. There was nothing left to say. When we were done, I stood up, ready to leave. I'd packed what I needed the night before, and I didn't want to stay in this house a moment longer than I had to. As I grabbed my bag, Sarah stood up, her eyes wet with tears again. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "For everything. I never meant to hurt you." I looked at her, feeling a strange sense of detachment. The words were meaningless now. They didn't change anything. "I know," I said, my voice quiet but final. "But it's too late for that." And with that, I walked out the door, leaving the life we had built behind. I didn't know where I was going yet. Maybe to Mark's place for a few nights, maybe to a hotel until I found something more permanent. But as I drove away, I realized something important. I wasn't looking back. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about what I could have done differently or how I could have saved our marriage. I was thinking about what came next, about how I would rebuild. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, it didn't scare me. It felt like freedom, and that was enough. The house, the memories, the lies, they were all behind me now. All I had to do was keep driving, keep moving forward, and that's exactly what I did. I deleted the photo, then another and another. Each picture felt like a lie now, a reminder of what I thought we had but never really did. The more I scrolled, the more I realized how much of my life I had invested in someone who wasn't the person I thought she was. Finally, I put the phone down for good and just stared at the ceiling, letting the quiet settle in. There was no going back. I knew that now. No amount of words or promises could change what had happened. Sarah had made her choice, and now I had made mine. This was the first night of my new life alone. But maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. Maybe, after everything, it was time to figure out who I was without her, to reclaim the pieces of myself I had lost in the years of trying to hold on to something that was already gone. As I drifted into restless sleep, one thought kept repeating in my mind, "It's over," and this time I wasn't scared of what that meant.